In this video, we're going to tie a version of Dave Whitlock's Bead-Head Rubber Leg Fox Squirrel Nymph, and that's a very long name for a really buggy and fishy looking fly. And this is a version of his very effective standard fox squirrel nymph pattern, which is super effective on trout and panfish, and this buggy version should be just as well. So let's get started. The hook I have in the vise is an Umpqua U555 size 12 jig hook. This is a slightly long, heavy wire jig hook that works really well for this pattern. Now, Dave Whitlock used a 2x long nymph hook, but we're doing this jig hook today. And on that hook, I've placed a 5/32 tungsten bead, a slotted tungsten bead. And Dave Whitlock used lead wraps on his, but this tungsten bead gives me about the sink rate I want, so we're not going to use lead wire on this copy. And for thread, I'm using UTC 70 denier, and then this is in burnt orange, which is a nice match for the dubbing and colors on this fly. And I give it a number of wraps right at the bead to create a bit of a thread dam, and it takes quite a few wraps with this thin 70 denier thread to stabilize that bead. But we want it stabilized so it doesn't flop around while we're tying the fly. And then if I hold the thread toward me, it helps form a little ramp to wrap back to the bend of the hook, roughly touching wraps all the way back to the bend of the hook. And on this hook, that is about the hook barb, so about right there. And then I move my thread back to about the point of the hook, just in front of the point of the hook, and then trim off that excess. Now, for the tail of the fly, Dave Whitlock specified the back body fur from a fox squirrel, and that's really hard to find, and what I have found is almost black in color, and he does say that hare's mask is a good substitute, but I'm using rabbit zonker strip, and this is dyed sand variant. This is very close color to the rest of the body, and with black tips, it's pretty close to a fox squirrel, so that's what we're using on this copy. Now, I've left the fur on the zonker strip, and I've cut a piece about 3/8 of an inch, maybe just a bit more long. And it's really nice to use these zonker strips because you can cut consistent lengths of this for each of your flies, and it will make the tails about the same size on each one. So I'll just pinch that fur together, that hide together, and we want a tail that's about a half hook shank long, so that looks about right. So I'll give that just a couple of fairly loose wraps there and check it, and I think that's about right. So then while holding that fur up and towards me, I make touching wraps or close to touching wraps all the way back to the bend of the hook. And again, on this hook, that is about the barb, so right about there, and then I can take open spiral wraps back to the front. Now I can simply pull up this hide, this fur strip, and twist it a bit, and then cut off the excess, and it doesn't leave much waste at all. Now for the rib on the fly, Dave Whitlock specifies for this size small French oval tinsel, and this is UTC's version of that. So this is small gold tinsel. And we lay that tinsel on the near side of the hook, take a couple of loose wraps and just pull it back, and then we can take open spiral wraps. They don't have to be touching all the way back to the back of our thread base. Now it's important that we tie this tinsel all the way to the back of our thread base, because if we don't, and then when we wrap this tinsel forward, it would pull the dubbing up and expose the thread base. So I'll bring my thread now back in front of the point and let it hang right there. Now for the first part of the body on the fly, we're using Dave Whitlock's SLF dubbing, and this is his Red Fox Squirrel Nymph dubbing in Abdomen color. And we're only going to dub it to about, a full bead width behind the bead, because this portion is going to have our thorax and our legs and those other materials at the front. So we're going to dub it to about right there. And I pull out my thread, and I want a thin dubbing noodle here, about 3 inches long. And remember, with dubbing, less is more. So we just dub a thin noodle. And we want to leave a little bit of bare thread at the top, because that, as we wrap our dubbing to the rear, that lets us start our dubbing right at the rear of the hook. So now I have a dubbing noodle about 3 inches long. Whoops, grab my clump of dubbing there. And I make open spiral wraps to the rear to where that dubbing starts right at the thread base, at the rear of the thread base, and then make touching wraps forward. And to create a little taper, I can actually wrap over each wrap a bit. And let me tighten that down just a little. And finish that dubbing, again, about a bead width behind the bead. Right about there, and let the thread hang there. Then I can take my oval tinsel and begin spiral wraps forward with that. That's 3, 4, 5 wraps, and then when I reach the thread, I like to take a little wrap around the thread and then take thread wraps to secure that tinsel, and I can trim off my excess. Our next body material is another Dave Whitlock SLF dubbing, but this is the Thorax colors, Red Fox Squirrel Nymph and Thorax color. And here we want to dub about half of that gap initially. We'll come back and dub the rest of it later. But so I'll make a fairly short dubbing noodle, maybe 1.5 inches long. And I want this thorax to be slightly larger in diameter than the body of the fly, the abdomen that we just dubbed. And so I start dubbing right in front of that abdomen and just make wraps one over the other. And it's not much larger, it's just a bit larger, and it continues that taper of the body. So that looks about right. And we leave our thread hanging right at the front of that dubbing. Now our next material is legs, and this is where we differ a bit from Dave Whitlock's version as well. He ties 2 pair of legs for 4 legs on each side, and I'm going to use one pair of legs, or 1 segment. And this is a brown round rubber leg. This is size medium, and it's cut to about 3 inches. And what I like to do to tie in the legs is push them against the thread, bring them up and over the hook, and then I can just release them on the near side of the hook for the first segments. Then take another piece, push it around for the far side, and release it there. So I have roughly an X with those legs. And we can position them just a bit. And then I take a couple of medium tension thread wraps. I want to be able to adjust these legs, so I don't want tight thread wraps. So I still have my X there. Now, we grab our thorax dubbing once more, and we make another short dubbing noodle with it. And this one only about 1 inch long. So we're going to now wrap between these legs. So I'm going to make 1, 2, maybe 3 wraps in this case between those legs. I'm wrapping right between the legs, then I pull the legs forward and then wrap the remaining dubbing just in front of the legs. We've got one leg that's hiding there. And we can straighten them back out. That's why we don't make those thread wraps very high tension. Now our next material is a hackle, a soft hackle on the front of the fly, and this is just India henback in speckled brown. And we want to strip off all of these fuzzies, this marabou at the bottom, and leave the main tip in the front. And once we do that, we're left with about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch of feather. And to prep this for tie-in, I take my hackle pliers and hold about the first 1/4 of an inch or so of that feather. And then I pull all the other fibers to the rear, and this creates this triangular tie-in point. Now, what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to wrap the thread initially around this tie-in point at the base of the triangle, and then I'm going to pull that triangle back to where my thread is actually over these fibers, which makes a stronger connection for our tie-in. So I'll lay that feather just on the near side of the hook with the base of that triangle right behind my bead, and take a couple of thread wraps, a couple of loose thread wraps. And then I will pull that feather back, and you can see how it pulls that triangle under my thread. And now I have a bit stronger tie-in point, and I avoid that really fragile feather shaft at the base of that triangle. Let's trim the rest of that off. And our legs are misbehaving a bit, but we will take care of those in a little bit. And I grab my hackle pliers, and you don't have to use hackle pliers, but I am here, and grab that hackle, and I pull those feathers to the rear and kind of sweep everything back as I make each wrap. And let's see, there's 1 wrap of hackle, 2, trying to keep those legs out of the way, 3, and about 3 1/2, and now I'm back to bare stem, and I wrap my thread over that bare stem, and a couple of wraps in front of it, and then reach in with my scissors and clip off that bare stem. And we're going to take care of those little fuzzies here in just a second. So for one last time, I go back to my thorax dubbing and make a very short, thin dubbing noodle, about 1 inch, and it's really thin. And I pull everything back and make several dubbing noodle wraps in front, and then take my whip finish tool and whip finish right behind the bead with a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. Trim off that excess thread. I'm going to adjust our legs down a little bit here. We're going to trim those in just a second. Get rid of some of those extra fuzzies, and of course we need some head cement. This is Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails on those wraps right behind the bead. And then to trim the legs, I don't really measure them. I just pull them kind of straight up like this and use my thumb and finger as a guide and just trim them off there, and that makes them about the right length. And straighten them out just a bit. And those are just a bit long, so I'm going to trim them down a bit. And we don't want them so long that they'll foul in the bend of the hook. So there we have it. There is the Bead-Head Rubber Leg Red Fox Squirrel Nymph, which is a really long title for a fly, but it's a really buggy fly, really fishy fly. So I hope you'll give it a try. I think you'll really enjoy it.